I think one of the favorite lines that parents like to use when they ask their children to do something and their kids don't budge is, "Are you deaf?" Have you ever heard that before? Anyone ever heard that before? John, you heard that one before? Okay, all right. So, Evan, you heard that one before back there? Okay, all right. Just making sure, all right. So let's see. Mary, you've heard that one? Yeah, okay, all right. Servers, have you heard that one before? Just making sure they're not deaf. Okay, good. All right, so, right. Of course, the parent knows that their son or daughter has not suddenly been struck with hearing loss. Normally, they say that because there's one of two causes. Either the child hears but ignores what the parent is saying, or doesn't really hear because the child is distracted at that moment. Jesus affects a pretty straightforward healing in the gospel today of a man who was deaf. Obviously, this healing was life-changing for the man in question. He can now communicate freely with those around him. He probably now can hear music for the first time in his life. It also means that he will now be aware of dangers that he wasn't aware of before because, if a tree snaps, he's going to hear it, or hears a chariot coming in his direction, he can move over. It also is going to eliminate frustration, the frustration of miscommunication. When having to express himself, with signs and gestures, or people don't have the patience to try to take the time with him, or just, write him off because he can't hear or communicate effectively. I think this last point is echoed in our second reading that comes from the letter of James in a different way. It's when we give preferential treatment to the beautiful people and ignore those who don't meet that standard of our expectations. James says there's nothing wrong with that. Notice the difference in attitude that James castigates. That one group, they come in and someone's nicely dressed and they're well groomed and they seem to be someone promised, "Oh, here, come sit here, we'll make space for you." And the second person who comes in who isn't well groomed, certainly not wealthy, maybe even dressed shabbily, maybe even smells, and well, you just stand or sit on the floor. James says there's something wrong with that. And think this is a challenge for us all. It's very easy for us just to judge by externals. Even more so that we think about this in modern society, where people's likes and popularity is based on the most superficial of things. To do the right thing most often requires us to make extra effort. Think of it this way. It requires no effort just to eat what looks good and what is tasty. But on the other hand, it requires effort to eat only healthy things, to pass up that dessert, whereas we do, especially during Lent, when we fast. But that extra effort is so worth it, both for ourselves and for others. For when we make that extra effort to reach out to someone, to include, not to judge us by externals, it allows us the ability to encounter the real person and not just write them off based on a prejudgment or externals. And it impacts that person as well when they are treated like a real person with human dignity, as God would expect us. Today would normally be the feast of St. Teresa of Calcutta, who certainly in her life didn't judge by externals, but saw God in every human being, regardless of their state in life. So next time we might be tempted to judge or exclude, make that extra effort. Make that extra effort in the name of the Lord. But let's go back to the gospel. We might be tempted to think that this gospel really has nothing to do with us. After all, you can hear just fine. But perhaps there's another type of deafness that we suffer from, a type of spiritual deafness. Just like that parent talking to a child, maybe that's what inflicts us in some way. Sometimes we don't hear God because indeed we are distracted with other things. There are just so many things that can easily distract us from hearing God. You know, virtually every type of entertainment can be a distraction from God. But other things as well. Work, school, family needs and expectations. We can get so focused on those things that when God speaks to us, we don't hear him. You know, the first thing we must always do is listen for God. If we aren't listening for God, it'll be virtually impossible to listen to God. What are those things that distract you from being able to listen to God? And is there any way that you can put them aside for at least some period of time each and every day? I think the answer to that, of course, is yes. You know, it can be hard because we can be so accustomed to having these things around. We become so normative in our lives. But remember, quiet time with God is never, ever a waste of time. The other type of spiritual deafness is just as bad, if not worse. And that is when we hear God's voice, when we know what he's asking, but yet we ignore him. We say to ourselves, well, what I'm doing and what I want is more important than whatever it is God is asking of me. In this approach, we place ourselves above God. We decide that our opinions, our feelings, our desires are more important than what God wants. We end up, therefore, caring little for others, and because of that, our choices can impact others oftentimes very negatively. Because most important for us is our will. It becomes supreme. Both of these types of spiritual deafness ultimately lead only to isolation and alienation from God and others. The truth of the matter is, we are in just as much healing, if not more, as the deaf man portrayed in the gospel. Jesus cries out as he puts his fingers into the man's ears, "Ephphatha, be opened." Ask the Lord to do the same for you, to open your ears to hear him, to open your hearts to love him, to open your minds to know him, to open your will to follow him. Of course, Jesus doesn't just heal the man's deafness. He also heals his speech impediment. As we all know, speech is tied to hearing. You know, if you in your own life, if you find your tongue is stuck and you have a hard time proclaiming the gospel, then it's likely it's not your tongue that's the problem, but you're not really listening to God to begin with. When we truly listen to God, it will invariably manifest itself in what we say to others, and indeed, the very way we speak to others. So then, what are you going to do this week to better listen to God? Or are you going to ignore him? Or even worse, just do all the talking?